A millionaire surgeon's 8-year-old son hadn't moved his legs in 3 months, every specialist saying no hope. Then at midnight, a homeless janitor's boy slipped into the ICU and whispered 6 words that made the doctor's blood freeze. He's not broken, just forgotten how to fly. What this child did next defied every law of medicine and left doctors speechless. In 72 hours, everything changed. The fluorescent lights in Mercy General's pediatric intensive care unit hummed their endless tune, casting everything in that cold hospital glow that makes hope feel fragile as tissue paper. Room 204 had become a shrine to medical defeat, a testament to the limits of human knowledge and the cruel randomness of fate. Charts lined the walls like battle scars, each one documenting another failed attempt to bring feeling back to legs that had once run through summer sprinklers and climbed the ancient oak tree in their backyard. 8-year-old Zion Rivers lay motionless beneath dinosaur-printed sheets, his small frame dwarfed by the mechanical hospital bed that had become his entire world. The accident 3 months ago had stolen more than his ability to walk. It had stolen his infectious laugh, his endless curiosity, his brilliant light that used to fill every room he entered. The boy who used to ask a million questions about everything from why clouds float to how birds know which way to fly, now stared at the acoustic ceiling tiles in complete silence, watching dust particles dance in the afternoon sunbeams that slanted through the Venetian blinds. His father, Dr. Cameron Rivers, sat hunched in the vinyl chair he'd claimed as his second home. His tall frame folded uncomfortably into a space designed for shorter visitors. Cameron was everything the medical world respected and feared. Harvard-educated neurosurgeon, published researcher in 3 prestigious journals, department head at Johns Hopkins, a man who had spent 15 years fixing what other doctors couldn't even diagnose. His hands had guided scalpels through brain tissue so delicate that one wrong move meant the difference between a patient walking out or never walking again. But watching his son slip away piece by piece, day by agonizing day, had reduced him to something he'd never been before in his entire life, completely, utterly, devastatingly helpless. The spinal cord trauma is extensive and permanent, Dr. Patricia Hoffman had explained during their last consultation, her voice carrying that careful professional tone doctors use when delivering death sentences to hope. We've tried everything, Cameron. Stem cell therapy, electrical stimulation, every experimental treatment available in the United States and Europe. The damage is simply too severe. I'm sorry, but Zion will never walk again. The sooner you accept this reality, the sooner you can focus on helping him adapt to his new life. Those words echoed in Cameron's mind like a curse as he watched his son's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, each breath a reminder of life, continuing in a body that had forgotten how to truly live. The boy who used to narrate entire movies while watching them, who turned simple grocery store trips into elaborate treasure hunts complete with maps and riddles, now spoke maybe 10 words on a good day, and those words were usually just yes, no, and okay. Cameron had tried everything money could buy and influence could secure. Private jets to Switzerland for breakthrough treatments that cost more than most people's houses. Consultations with specialists who charged more per hour than most families made in a month. Robotic exoskeletons from Germany. Experimental drugs from Japan. Even a controversial faith healer his desperate mother-in-law had flown in from Ghana, who claimed to have restored sight to the blind and movement to the paralyzed. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close to working. The insurance company had stopped returning his calls. The hospital administrators had begun making subtle suggestions about long-term care facilities. Even his closest colleagues, men and women who had witnessed him perform medical miracles in operating rooms, now looked at him with that particular combination of pity and discomfort that people reserve for those who refuse to accept the unacceptable. But Cameron couldn't accept it. Wouldn't accept it. This was his son, his only child, the boy who had made him understand for the first time in his life what it meant to love someone more than your own existence. The boy who had rushed into his arms every evening when he came home from the hospital shouting, "Daddy's home, Daddy's home," like Cameron was a hero returning from war, instead of just a tired surgeon coming back from another day of trying to hold death at bay. The hospital at night became a different creature entirely. During the day, it buzzed with purpose and movement, nurses checking vitals, doctors making rounds, technicians wheeling patients to procedures, the constant hum of healing happening all around. But after midnight, the corridors stretched longer, sounds echoed differently, and hope felt both more precious and more impossible than it did in the harsh light of day. It was past midnight on a Tuesday when Cameron heard something that made him look up from the stack of medical journals he'd been reading, searching desperately for some treatment, some procedure, some miracle he might have missed. The sound drifted down the hallway like smoke, floating through the antiseptic air and settling into his soul before his mind could even process what he was hearing. Singing. Not the kind of singing you'd expect in a children's hospital, not the soft lullabies nurses sometimes hummed to comfort crying babies, or the gospel hymns that occasionally drifted from the chapel during evening services. This was different, raw and real and honest. A voice that carried pain and joy in equal measure, hope and heartbreak intertwined like threads in a tapestry, creating something beautiful from the collision of light and shadow. Cameron stood up slowly, his back protesting after hours in the uncomfortable chair, and stepped into the corridor. The pediatric wing was dimly lit, most of the rooms dark except for the soft glow of monitors and the occasional reading lamp. He followed the sound down the hallway, past the rooms where other families were fighting their own battles against fate, past the nurses' station, where the night shift staff worked quietly at their computers, past the small kitchen where parents sometimes tried to eat meals that tasted like cardboard because worry had stolen their ability to taste anything else. The singing led him to the supply closet at the far end of the wing, where he found a woman in a janitor's uniform sitting on an overturned bucket, humming while she methodically sorted medical supplies. She was maybe 40 years old, with hands that moved with the kind of unconscious grace that comes from years of caring for others, and eyes that held the particular warmth of someone who had seen too much sadness, but had somehow managed to keep her heart open anyway. "I'm sorry," Cameron said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "I didn't mean to interrupt." The woman looked up, completely unstarted, as if she'd been expecting him all along. "Dr. Rivers, how's your boy tonight?" Cameron blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are. I'm Naomi Washington. I clean this wing every night, have for the past 8 years. She stood up slowly, dusting off her uniform with practiced efficiency. "Been watching you these past 3 months, man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, trying to hold it all together with nothing but pure determination and stubbornness." Cameron felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart, to keep the fear and desperation from overwhelming him completely. "I don't know what else to do. I've tried everything. Every treatment, every specialist, every prayer to a God I'm not even sure I believe in anymore." Naomi studied his face with the kind of careful attention that made him feel truly seen for the first time in months. Not seen as Dr. Rivers, the renowned neurosurgeon, or Dr. Rivers, the published researcher, but as Cameron, the father who was slowly dying inside while watching his child slip away. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the trying gets in the way of the healing. I'm a surgeon. Trying is what I do, it's who I am. And you're a father. Being is what you do." She paused, gathering her cleaning supplies with the same methodical care she'd shown while sorting the medical equipment. "My son Isaiah wants to meet your boy." "Your son?" "He's 12 years old. Special kind of special, if you know what I mean. Sees things the rest of us miss, hears things the rest of us can't quite catch." Naomi secured the supplies in her cart. "He's asked me 3 times this week when he could visit the boy in room 204. Says Zion's been calling to him in his dreams, asking for help, remembering something important." Cameron felt his medical training kick in automatically, his rational mind ready to dismiss what sounded like superstition, the kind of magical thinking that desperate people cling to when science fails them. But something in Naomi's eyes stopped him cold. There was no desperation there, no wild hope or delusional thinking, just a quiet certainty that made him want to listen instead of lecture. "What kind of special?" he asked carefully. The kind that makes doctors uncomfortable because it can't be measured or explained or replicated in a laboratory. She smiled, and her whole face transformed. But maybe that's exactly what your boy needs right now. Someone who doesn't see a medical case when they look at him. Someone who sees a child who's lost his way and needs help finding the path back home. That night, Cameron couldn't sleep, which wasn't unusual. He'd barely slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the accident. But this restlessness was different. He kept thinking about Naomi's words, about the singing that had drawn him into the hallway like a fish to bait, about the calm certainty in her voice when she spoke about her son. At 3 a.m., he found himself back in Zion's room, watching his son's peaceful face in the dim light cast by the monitors. Zion looked so small in the hospital bed, so fragile and young. Cameron had forgotten sometimes, over the past 3 months, that his son was still just a little boy. The medical crisis had aged them both, turning everyday conversations into discussions of treatment options and prognoses, transforming bedtime stories into explanations of procedures and medications. When had he stopped seeing his child and started seeing only the medical problem he couldn't solve? "Daddy?" Zion's voice was barely a whisper, rusty from sleep. "I'm here, buddy." I had the dream again, the one about the boy. Cameron's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time Zion had mentioned any dreams in weeks. "What boy?" "The one who says he's coming to teach me how to fly again. He has kind eyes like Mama used to have, and he plays music that makes me remember things I thought I forgot." Cameron's throat tightened painfully. Zion's mother, Sarah, had died in the same accident that had paralyzed him. A drunk driver running a red light, a moment of impact that had shattered their entire world into before and after. They rarely talked about her anymore. It hurt too much, and Cameron had convinced himself that avoiding the pain was the same as protecting his son from it. "What does he say in the dream?" Cameron asked, his voice barely steady. "That I'm not broken, just sleeping. That my legs are waiting for me to wake up and remember how to use them. And that you're sadder than I am, which makes it harder for me to get better." Zion turned his head on the pillow to look directly at his father. "Are you sadder than me, Daddy?" The question hit Cameron like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He'd been so focused on maintaining his composure, on being strong for his son, on projecting confidence in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, that he'd never stopped to consider how his own grief might be affecting Zion's healing. "Maybe I am, buddy. Maybe I am. The boy in the dream says you need to remember how to sing. He says Mama used to love it when you sang, especially when you thought nobody was listening." Cameron's vision blurred with sudden tears. "I don't sing anymore, Zion." "You used to, though, before the accident, remember? You'd sing that song about the mockingbird when I couldn't sleep, and you'd make up funny verses that made me laugh so hard I'd forget why I was scared." Cameron did remember, though the memory felt like it belonged to someone else, some other version of himself who had existed in the before times. Late nights when Zion was a baby and then a toddler, walking the floors of their house, singing off-key lullabies while Sarah slept. He'd sung in the car in the shower while cooking breakfast on Saturday mornings. He hadn't sung a single note since the accident, hadn't even realized he'd stopped until this moment. "The boy in the dream says you're afraid to sing now because you think it means you're giving up on fixing me with medicine. But he says music is medicine too, just a different kind." The next evening, Cameron found himself watching the clock as visiting hours wound down, wondering if Naomi would actually bring her son to meet Zion. Part of him hoped she wouldn't. He was a man of science, trained to trust evidence and data, not dreams and intuition. But a larger part of him, the part that was purely a father and not a doctor, found himself hoping desperately that this boy, this Isaiah, might somehow see something that all the specialists had missed. At 7:30, just as the day shift nurses were finishing their final rounds, Naomi appeared in the doorway with a boy who seemed to carry sunlight in his pocket. Isaiah was small for 12, with expressive dark eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than his years should have allowed, and a smile that made the sterile hospital room feel instantly warmer and more alive. "This is my son," Naomi said simply, her hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Isaiah walked directly to Zion's bed without any hesitation. as if he'd made this journey 1,000 times before in his dreams. "Hey, Zion. I'm Isaiah. You ready to remember?" "Remember what?" Zion asked, but Cameron noticed immediately that his son was sitting up straighter in bed than he had in weeks, more alert and present than he'd been since before the accident. "How to fly. Your legs aren't the only things that can take you places." Isaiah pulled a small, worn harmonica from his jacket pocket. "Your daddy used to fly all the time, before the accident made him forget how, before he got so scared of losing you that he stopped believing in anything he couldn't cut open and fix with his hands." Cameron stepped forward, his medical training and parental instincts both kicking in at once. "Now wait just a minute." "It's okay, Dr. Rivers," Isaiah said calmly, not taking his eyes off Zion. "Fear makes perfect sense when you lose something precious. But what if you didn't really lose it? What if it just got buried under all the worry and sadness, waiting for someone to help you dig it back up?" Isaiah put the harmonica to his lips and began to play. The melody was simple and haunting, somehow both unfamiliar and deeply known, like a song from a half-remembered dream. Zion's eyes widened with recognition. "That's the song from my dreams, the one the boy plays when he's teaching me to remember." "It's your mama's song," Isaiah said softly. "She used to hum it when she was pregnant with you, and then she'd sing it while she rocked you to sleep. She's been trying to teach it to you again, but you've been listening with your hurt instead of your heart." Cameron felt the room start to spin around him. "How could you possibly know that? Sarah never recorded herself singing. She was too shy to sing in front of anyone except you and Zion," Isaiah finished. "She's here, Dr. Rivers. She's been here every single night since the accident, sitting in that chair you sleep in, singing to both of you. But grief is loud, and her voice is gentle, so it's hard to hear her over all the fear." As if responding to some invisible conductor, Zion began to hum along with the harmonica. His voice was rusty from months of barely speaking, but it carried a sweetness that made Cameron's eyes fill with tears. This was the first time he'd heard his son make music since the accident, the first time he'd seen him engage with anything beyond the basic necessities of survival. "There you go," Isaiah whispered, never stopping his playing. "Now close your eyes and listen for her words. She's been waiting so long for you to hear them." Zion closed his eyes, still humming along with the simple melody. As Cameron watched in amazement, his son's hands, which had been clenched into fists for months, as if he were holding on to something he was afraid to lose, slowly began to open. His shoulders, which had been rigid with held tension and unspoken grief, gradually started to relax, and then, impossibly miraculous and undeniable, Zion's left toe moved. Just once, just barely. But Cameron saw it, and his medical training told him immediately that what he was witnessing should not be happening. The spinal cord damage was too extensive, the paralysis too complete. According to every test they'd run, every scan they'd analyzed, every consultation they'd held, the neural pathways that controlled movement in Zion's legs had been severed beyond repair. "Did you see?" Cameron started, but Naomi placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Shh," she whispered. "Let them work. Some kinds of healing need quiet to grow." Isaiah continued playing, and Zion continued humming, and in that sterile hospital room filled with machines and monitors and the antiseptic smell of institutional care, something that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with love began to unfold like a flower opening to the sun. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Isaiah finally lowered the harmonica. The room felt different now, charged with possibility, in a way that made Cameron's skin tingle with electricity. "That's enough for tonight," Isaiah said, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. "Too much too fast makes the spirit dizzy, and we need his spirit strong for what comes next." "Will you come back?" Zion asked, and Cameron was struck by how much stronger his son's voice sounded, how much more present he seemed. "Every night until you remember how to fly on your own." Isaiah looked directly at Cameron, those wise eyes seeming to see straight through to his soul. "But your daddy has to learn the song too, Dr. Rivers. You can't fly alone when you're 8 years old. You need your father to teach you how to trust the wind." That night, after Naomi and Isaiah had disappeared into the hospital corridors as quietly as they'd arrived, Cameron sat by Zion's bed with a small notebook he'd borrowed from the nurse's station. He was trying to remember the lullaby he used to sing, the one that had been such a natural part of their bedtime routine that he'd never thought to write down the words. It came back in fragments, a phrase here, a melody there, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered and was now slowly reassembling itself. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Daddy's going to buy you a mockingbird." "That's it," Zion said, more animated than he'd been in months. "But you're missing the best part. Mama changed some of the words. She made it better." How did she change them? Instead of buying things, she sang about flying. "Hush, little baby, don't you cry, Mama's going to teach you how to fly." Cameron's voice broke completely. The memory rushed back like a dam bursting, Sarah, heavy with pregnancy, singing her modified version of the old lullaby. Then later, after Zion was born, the nights when their son would have nightmares about falling or getting lost, and Sarah would rock him and sing about flying instead of fear, about soaring instead of falling, about always being able to find his way home because love would be his compass. "She sang it the night before the accident," Zion said quietly, "when I had that bad dream about the monsters under my bed. She said, even if monsters were real, they couldn't catch someone who knew how to fly." Cameron pulled his chair closer to the bed and took his son's small hand in both of his own. "I remember now, buddy. I remember all of it." Isaiah returned the next night, and the night after that, and every night for the following week. Each evening he would slip into room 204 like a secret, pull out his worn harmonica, and fill the space with melodies that seemed to unlock something deep inside both father and son. And each night, something that defied medical explanation continued to happen. First, it was just toes wiggling in response to the music, then an ankle flexing slightly when Isaiah played certain notes. By the end of the first week, Zion could bend his left knee just barely, but enough to make the monitoring equipment beep with readings that sent the medical staff into hushed consultations in the hallway. Dr. Patricia Hoffman ran test after test, her confusion growing with each set of results. "This is unprecedented, Cameron," she told him privately after reviewing the latest MRI scans. "The spinal cord damage is still clearly visible on all our imaging. By every measure we have, every piece of medical knowledge we possess, this level of motor function return shouldn't be possible." "But it is happening," Cameron said, trying to keep the hope out of his voice, because hope felt too dangerous, too fragile to speak aloud. "Yes, it's happening, but I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this recovery could plateau or even reverse. Sometimes the body has phantom responses to trauma, temporary improvements that don't represent actual healing of the underlying damage." But Cameron had stopped listening to medical explanations because he'd started paying attention to something more important, the light returning to his son's eyes. Whether the movement in Zion's legs was permanent or temporary, whether it could be explained by science or not, his child was coming back to life in ways that had nothing to do with motor function and everything to do with joy. Still, doubt crept in during the long hours when he was alone with his thoughts. Cameron was a scientist, trained from childhood to trust data over intuition, evidence over faith. What if Dr. Hoffman was right? What if this was just a cruel tease before the inevitable reality of permanent paralysis set in? What if he was allowing himself and his son to hope for something that would only lead to even greater heartbreak? That night, when Isaiah arrived for his usual visit, Cameron confronted him directly. "Are you giving my son false hope? Are you making promises you can't keep?" Isaiah looked at him with those ancient eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older than 12. "Dr. Rivers, what do you think hope is? Her feeling that things will get better." "No, sir. Hope is a choice to keep loving even when you can't see the outcome. Hope is deciding that the story isn't over just because you can't read the next chapter yet." Isaiah sat down in the visitor's chair across from Cameron. "Your son isn't healing because I'm playing music. Music is just the doorway. He's healing because you're finally learning to love him in his brokenness, instead of spending all your energy trying to fix him. That doesn't make medical sense. Medical sense says love is just chemicals in the brain, that consciousness is just electrical impulses, that everything that matters can be reduced to data and measurements." Isaiah smiled. But you and I both know there's more to the story than what fits in a textbook. Your wife knew that too. Cameron felt his chest tighten. Don't talk about my wife. You don't know anything about Sarah. She asked me to talk about her. The words hit Cameron like ice water, flooding his veins. What did you say? She visits me sometimes. In dreams, in quiet moments when I'm sitting by the window at home, in the space between sleeping and waking. She's worried about you both. Says you stopped believing in anything you couldn't cut open and stitch back together. And that's making it harder for Zion to believe in his own healing. Cameron stood up abruptly, his rational mind reeling. That's enough, this has gone too far, I think you need to leave. Isaiah nodded calmly, as if he'd been expecting this reaction. I understand why you're scared, Dr. Rivers. But before I go, can I tell you what she said about the night Zion was born? Despite every logical instinct screaming at him to stop this conversation, Cameron found himself unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen. She said you sang to him for 3 hours straight while she slept after the delivery. Just made up songs about his tiny fingers and his perfect ears and how he was going to change the world someday. She said it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, because it wasn't just music, it was love made audible, hope given voice. Cameron sank back into his chair, his knees suddenly too weak to support him. She said you haven't sung to him since the accident because you're afraid. Afraid that if you love him too much in his broken state, you'll stop fighting to fix him. Afraid that acceptance means giving up. But she wants you to know. He doesn't need fixing, Dr. Rivers. He needs flying. And you're the only one who can teach him how. That night, after Isaiah had slipped away into the hospital corridors like smoke, Cameron sat beside Zion's bed and sang every lullaby he could remember. His voice was rough and unpracticed, breaking on the high notes and cracking with emotion, but Zion smiled wider than he had since before the accident. Daddy, you sound like Mama now. What do you mean? Like you're not afraid of the music anymore. Like you remember that singing is just another way of saying I love you. Over the following weeks, something fundamental shifted in room 204. The space that had felt like a medical bunker, a place where they were fighting a losing battle against fate, began to feel like a healing sanctuary. Cameron brought in a small keyboard from the hospital's music therapy department, and he and Zion spent hours making up songs together. Silly songs about hospital food, beautiful songs about missing Mama, hopeful songs about all the places they'd go when Zion could walk again. Naomi would stop by during her breaks, sometimes adding her rich, alto voice to their impromptu concerts. Other families began to gather in the hallway outside their room, drawn by the sound of music and laughter coming from a place that had been synonymous with grief for so long. And Isaiah. Isaiah became the quiet conductor of something that could only be called miraculous. Under his gentle guidance, Zion's recovery accelerated beyond all medical explanation. By week 3, both legs were responding to stimulus. By week 4, he could sit up unassisted without any mechanical support. By week 5, he was strong enough to transfer himself from the bed to a wheelchair with minimal assistance. The hospital staff whispered about spontaneous healing, divine intervention, medical anomalies that would be written up in journals and discussed at conferences. Reporters started calling, wanting to interview the boy who was defying medical science and the father who had never given up hope. But Cameron declined all interviews, all publicity, because he understood now that what was happening in room 204 was too sacred to be turned into a news story. The truth was simpler and more profound than any medical explanation could capture. The healing wasn't happening to Zion, it was happening to all of them. In learning to sing again, Cameron had learned to hope again. In choosing to love his son's brokenness, instead of spending all his energy fighting it, he had created space for wholeness to emerge. In accepting that not everything could be fixed with surgical precision, he had opened himself to the possibility that some things heal in ways that defy understanding but demand belief. On a Thursday evening in week 6, Isaiah arrived with tears glistening in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Zion asked immediately, his voice filled with concern. "Nothing's wrong, little brother. Everything's exactly right, but I have to go away soon." "Go where?" There's another family in Atlanta that needs help remembering how to fly. A little girl whose mama stopped singing after her daddy died in Afghanistan. She's been waiting in the dark for someone to teach her that music can be medicine." Zion's face fell. "But what if I forget how to fly without you here to remind me?" Isaiah smiled and pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small carved wooden harmonica, polished smooth by countless hands. "This is for you to keep, but you won't need it much longer, because you're almost ready for the biggest flight of all." "What's the biggest flight?" "Walking, Zion. You're going to walk again. Not just a few steps, but really walk, run, dance, jump, everything you used to do, and more." That Sunday morning, with most of the hospital staff gathered outside room 204 and Cameron holding his breath, Zion Rivers swung his legs over the side of his bed, placed his feet firmly on the cold linoleum floor, and stood up. Not the tentative, uncertain standing of someone learning to walk again after months of paralysis. Not the mechanical, assisted standing of someone being helped by medical equipment. Real standing, strong standing. Standing like a boy who had simply decided it was time to fly. Then he took a step, then another, walking across the room with growing confidence until he was running, actually running, into his father's arms. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers, and tears of joy, but Cameron barely heard any of it. All he could hear was his son's laughter, bright and pure and fully alive, mixing with his own sobs of relief and gratitude and overwhelming love. Isaiah watched from the doorway, his young face glowing with quiet satisfaction and deep peace. As the celebration continued around them, he slipped away unnoticed, but not before leaving something on the nightstand, a note written in careful 12-year-old handwriting. "Dr. Rivers, your wife says to tell you she's proud of the song you learned to sing again. She says Zion's music is going to heal other people now too, so keep teaching him the words. Keep teaching everyone the words. The world needs more flying and less fear. Love, Isaiah. P.S. Zion will dance at his wedding someday, and when he does, save me a dance too. I'll be there." When Cameron looked up from the note to thank Isaiah, the boy was gone. The nurses said they hadn't seen him leave. The security cameras showed footage of the celebration, but no trace of a 12-year-old boy walking away. But it didn't matter, because Cameron understood now that some presences don't need to be captured on film to be real, and some miracles don't need to be explained to be true. 6 months later, Dr. Cameron Rivers used a significant portion of his savings to open the Sarah Rivers Memorial Pediatric Music Therapy Wing at Mercy General Hospital. The opening ceremony featured a performance by Zion Rivers, age 8, playing Amazing Grace on a wooden harmonica while his father sang and accompanied him on piano. In the audience sat Naomi Washington, beaming with pride and joy, next to an empty chair she had saved for her son. Isaiah hadn't returned since that Sunday morning, but his harmonica music could still be heard in the pediatric wing late at night, drifting from room to room like a lullaby made of hope and healing. And sometimes, just sometimes, families would find their way back to each other through the simple act of learning to sing again. Because miracles aren't always medical. Sometimes they're musical. Sometimes they're just love, made audible, in a world that had forgotten how to listen. The program grew beyond anything Cameron had imagined. Within a year, they had music therapists on staff, volunteer musicians who came to play for patients, and a recording studio where children could make songs to send home to families who couldn't visit. Zion became the unofficial ambassador of the program, visiting new patients and their families, teaching them that healing sometimes comes in the form of harmony. On the first anniversary of his recovery, Zion stood on a small stage in the music therapy wing's main room, surrounded by dozens of children and families whose lives had been touched by music and hope. He held a microphone in his small hands, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same gentle authority that Isaiah's had possessed. "My name is Zion Rivers, and a year ago I forgot how to fly. The doctors said I never would again, but a boy named Isaiah taught me something important. Sometimes you don't need your legs to fly. Sometimes you just need your heart to remember the song." He raised the wooden harmonica to his lips and began to play. The melody was simple and familiar now, but it still carried the power to transform sterile hospital rooms into sanctuaries, to turn medical charts into love letters, to remind everyone listening that miracles aren't just possible, they're happening all around us, every day, in the space between one breath and the next. As Zion played, Cameron sat at the piano and began to sing the words that Sarah had written so many years ago, the words that had been lost and found and lost again before finally coming home. Hush, little baby. Don't you cry. Mama's gonna teach you how to fly. And if that flying don't come true, Daddy's gonna sing his love to you. And if that song don't heal your heart, love will find you, set apart. And if that love don't see you through, God will send an angel just for you. In the back of the room, barely visible in the soft light, a 12-year-old boy with kind eyes and a gentle smile watched the performance. When the last note faded into silence, he nodded once, satisfied, and walked quietly toward the exit. But this time Zion saw him leaving. "Isaiah!" he called out, still holding the microphone. The boy turned back, his face bright with joy. "Thank you," Zion said, his young voice carrying across the room. "Thank you for teaching me to fly." Isaiah smiled and raised his hand in a small wave. "Thank you for teaching everyone else, little brother. Your mama's proud. We all are." And then he was gone again, but this time it felt different. Not like an ending, but like a beginning. Because the song was spreading now, carried by voices that had learned to sing again, by hearts that had remembered how to hope. Sometimes miracles don't come from medicine. They come from love made audible, hope given voice, and the courage to believe in what doctors can't explain. If this story reminded you that impossible things happen every day, subscribe for more true stories that will restore your faith in miracles. What song is your heart waiting to remember? Subscribe, share, believe. Because somewhere tonight, another child is learning to fly.